Ever heard of the cocaine queen who turned Miami into a bloodbath and made the cartel, the mafia, and the police afraid to act? In the early 1980s, Miami stopped feeling like a city. It started feeling like a war zone that never declared war. Bodies were found in parking lots before sunrise, executions outside grocery stores, killings so clean, so frequent that investigators stopped asking who did it and started asking who gave the order. Because every layer of power in the drug world was being touched at the same time. Colombian cartels refused to speak her name. Cuban traffickers rerouted shipments to avoid her reach. And even the mafia, men who built their entire identity on control, quietly stepped back from Miami's cocaine trade. One woman was at the center of it, Griselda Blanco, and she didn't compete in the drug war, she redesigned how it was fought. Chapter 1. When a city changed. In the early 1980s, Miami stopped behaving like a normal city. Bodies began appearing before sunrise, parking lots, residential streets, outside grocery stores in broad daylight. Nobody knew where the next one would happen. Everybody knew it was coming. At first it was one body, then another, then another. Police reports began to change. Homicide investigation became possible narcotics-related execution. Then even that became routine, because the pattern wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate. Patterns create predictions, and someone was writing the pattern. Years later, one homicide investigator described the shift in mindset simply. We stopped asking if it was connected. We started assuming it was. At first, investigators believed several groups were fighting for control. Colombian traffickers, Cuban smuggling networks, local intermediaries trying to survive a rapidly expanding cocaine market. It looked like a typical drug war, but something didn't fit. Most drug wars are reactive, messy, emotional, opportunistic. This wasn't. This felt calculated. Not chaos, control. Cartel routes began shifting without explanation. Entire trafficking corridors were abandoned after a single incident, not after a major financial loss, not after a prolonged conflict, after a message. In one case, a dispute over a cocaine shipment in Miami ended not through negotiation, but through a killing. What happened next surprised investigators even more. No retaliation, no public escalation, just silence. Years later, a Cuban trafficker described what frightened people most. It wasn't the violence, it was the speed. There was no second warning, he recalled. There was only correction. By 1983, something unusual had happened. Major trafficking organizations were changing their behavior around a single city. Miami wasn't becoming dangerous because of the police. It was becoming dangerous because no one could predict what would happen next. Every organization operating there understood the same reality. Control no longer belonged to the biggest player. It belonged to the one everyone feared most. Fear doesn't stay where it's created. It spreads through reputation, through whispers, through decisions made long before people ever meet. Fear doesn't just enforce power, fear is power. And in Miami, it had an architect. Her name was Griselda Blanco. Chapter 2. Fear was the first language she learned. Before Griselda Blanco became one of the most feared figures in the cocaine trade, fear was already shaping the world around her. She was born in Colombia in 1943. She spent much of her childhood in and around Medellin, where many families lived with poverty, instability, and everyday violence. For some children, home is where they learn trust. For others, survival comes first. The neighborhoods Griselda grew up in rewarded awareness more than innocence. You learned who carried a knife, which streets emptied before sunset, when to stay quiet, when to disappear. Every day became an exercise in reading people before they could read you. Over time, that changes how you see the world. Fear stops feeling like an interruption. It starts feeling normal. Imagine two children walking home from school. One looks both ways before crossing the street. The other looks both ways because someone might be following. The action is identical. The reason changes everything. One grows up expecting accidents. The other grows up expecting danger. Historians still debate many stories about Griselda's childhood. Accounts of theft, violence, even murder. Some appear in later biographies. Others remain impossible to verify. But the environment itself is far less disputed. For many families living in poverty during that period, violence wasn't exceptional. It was familiar. And when violence becomes familiar, people often stop seeing it as extraordinary. It becomes another part of life. As Griselda entered her teenage years, she drifted into petty crime, theft, street hustles, small jobs that paid quickly and asked few questions. Each success reinforced the same lesson. The world didn't always reward the strongest. It often rewarded the person willing to move first, while everyone else hesitated. Picture a crowded street market. Two teenagers steal fruit from a vendor. One grabs whatever he can and runs. The other waits. She watches where the vendor looks. She notices when customers create distractions. She leaves with twice as much. One sees an opportunity. The other studies a pattern. Long before cocaine entered her life, Griselda was developing a different way of thinking. She wasn't only reacting to danger, she was watching it. Learning how people behaved under pressure, who panicked, who hesitated, who looked away. Years later, those observations would become far more valuable than money, because cocaine could buy loyalty, but understanding fear could shape decisions before a single word was spoken. Most criminals spend their lives learning how to break the law. Griselda was learning something far more powerful, how fear changes human behavior. That lesson would shape every empire she built, long before she ever sold her first kilo of cocaine. Chapter 3. She didn't find a business. She found a gap. By the time Griselda reached adulthood, survival had become routine. Petty crime paid the bills. Small hustles came and went. Every day offered another opportunity to make money, if you were willing to take the risk. But while many people around her focused on the next score, Griselda started noticing something else. The people making the most money rarely touched the product. They didn't steal it. They moved it. They didn't carry the biggest risk. They controlled the flow. That's where the real power lived. Because every black market follows the same rules as every legal one. Someone manufactures, someone transports, someone distributes, someone collects. The closer you get to controlling the system, the less you need to pull the trigger yourself. Long before she built an empire, Griselda was learning that logistics could be more valuable than violence. Imagine two men selling newspapers on the same street. One wakes up earlier every morning, hoping to sell more copies. The other quietly convinces the delivery driver to leave every newspaper at his corner first. By breakfast, one has worked harder, the other has controlled the supply. They both made money. Only one built leverage. During the 1960s, Colombia's criminal economy was changing. Smuggling wasn't new. Contraband had moved across borders for decades. But new opportunities were emerging. Goods were becoming easier to transport. International routes were expanding. And wherever governments created restrictions, someone found profit in moving around them. Griselda understood something that many criminals overlooked. Every border, every customs checkpoint, every shipping route wasn't just an obstacle. It was a business opportunity. The people who mastered those routes wouldn't simply make money. They would become indispensable. A dock worker loads dozens of identical crates onto a cargo ship. He doesn't know what's inside. He doesn't ask. His job ends when the ship leaves port. Somewhere else, another person has already calculated which crate will be inspected, which official can be bribed, and which shipment will arrive exactly where it needs to. One man moves boxes. The other moves outcomes. Around this time, Griselda married Carlos Trujillo. Later, after his death, she became involved with Alberto Bravo, a smuggler with growing connections in the cocaine trade. Their relationship wasn't just personal. It became a partnership that opened the door to a market on the verge of exploding. Cocaine hadn't yet become America's obsession, but the demand was growing. Fast. Most people saw the product. Griselda saw the market. Others saw shipments. She saw a network. Others saw quick profits. She saw an empire waiting for someone bold enough to organize it. Cocaine was about to flood the United States. Millions of dollars would follow. Cartels would fight over territory. Governments would launch wars. But before any of that happened, Griselda made one decision that changed everything. She looked north, toward a city that had no idea what was coming. Miami. Chapter 4, she didn't sell cocaine. She built the pipeline. By the early 1970s, cocaine was finding its way into the United States. Demand exploded. Nightclubs wanted it. Celebrities wanted it. Dealers couldn't get enough of it. Most traffickers saw only one opportunity: move more cocaine. Griselda saw a different problem. How does it get there? Every kilo had to cross a border. Every shipment had to survive customs. Every courier had to reach the next handoff. One mistake, and the entire operation could disappear. The biggest supplier wasn't always the richest. The most reliable one usually was. Imagine two restaurants across the street from each other. One has the better chef. The other never runs out of ingredients. Customers eventually stop chasing the better meal. They return to the place they know will always be open. Reliability has a way of defeating brilliance. Working alongside Alberto Bravo, Griselda focused on something many traffickers overlooked: the system. Routes were tested. Couriers were replaced when they became liabilities. Each successful shipment strengthened the network. Each failure exposed another weakness. According to investigators, her organization became known for constantly adapting its smuggling methods. Among the most infamous were specially designed undergarments with hidden compartments, allowing couriers to conceal cocaine while passing through airport security. As law enforcement changed, the methods changed with it. The goal wasn't innovation for its own sake. It was staying one step ahead. Picture an airport customs officer watching hundreds of passengers. He looks for shaking hands, avoided eye contact, heavy luggage. Across the terminal, someone walks calmly, carries almost nothing, smiles, blends into the crowd. The officer remembers the suspicious traveler. He rarely remembers the ordinary one. Before long, the money stopped arriving in stacks. It arrived by the millions. Success attracted suppliers. Suppliers attracted distributors. Distributors attracted even more business. The operation stopped depending on individuals. It began functioning like a network. But every successful network creates the same problem: competition. More cocaine meant more traffickers. More traffickers meant more disputes. Negotiations took time. Trust could disappear overnight. Griselda wanted something far more reliable. She already knew how to move cocaine across borders. Now she wanted to make sure nobody interfered with the route. Most traffickers protected their business with money. Griselda was about to protect hers with something far more powerful: a reputation so terrifying that people made decisions before she ever entered the room. The cocaine built her fortune. Fear would build her empire. Chapter 5. Fear became the product. Every growing business eventually faces the same question: how do you protect what you've built? Most companies hire lawyers, install security systems, write contracts. Criminal organizations have fewer options. Their agreements aren't enforced in court, they're enforced through reputation. Griselda understood something many traffickers didn't. A reputation can travel faster than any shipment. Every time someone stole from her, delayed a payment, or crossed one of her lines, she wasn't only responding to the person in front of her, she was sending a message to everyone watching. What happens today determines what everyone else attempts tomorrow. Imagine a shopkeeper who discovers someone has been stealing from his store. He could quietly replace the missing merchandise and move on. Or he could place a sign in the front window: "Smile, you're on camera." Most customers never intended to steal. The sign isn't for them. It's for the one person still making up their mind. Sometimes, the warning changes more behavior than the punishment. As the cocaine trade expanded, so did the number of people competing for it. Territory became disputed, shipments disappeared, partnerships dissolved. Trust became increasingly rare. Griselda's response was brutally simple. She wanted every rival, every courier, every business partner to believe the same thing: cross her, and the consequences would arrive quickly. According to investigators and later court testimony, her organization became associated with numerous contract killings linked to cocaine routes, unpaid debts, and territorial disputes. The exact number remains debated. The reputation does not. Soon, people no longer needed to witness the violence themselves. The stories traveled on their own, and stories have a way of growing with every retelling. Picture a young trafficker arriving in Miami for the first time. Before his first meeting, an older smuggler offers a single piece of advice: if her name comes up, listen more than you speak. No explanation, no examples, just a warning. Sometimes fear arrives long before the person who created it. Around this time, a new pattern began appearing across Miami. Two people on a motorcycle, one driving, one shooting. The attacks happened quickly. The riders disappeared into traffic before police could react. While historians continue to debate exactly who introduced the tactic, law enforcement widely associated its growing use during Miami's cocaine wars with Griselda Blanco's organization. Whether every attack was connected to her mattered less than what people believed, because belief changes behavior. Soon, ordinary places no longer felt ordinary. A red light, a restaurant, a supermarket parking lot, places where people expected routine, became places where anything could happen. Fear escaped the criminal underworld. It entered everyday life. By now, Griselda had achieved something remarkably rare. She no longer needed to enter every room. Her reputation arrived first. It negotiated, it intimidated, it made decisions on her behalf. But every empire built on fear carries the same weakness. The more people fear you, the more people begin searching for the moment you're vulnerable. And by the early 1980s, Griselda Blanco had become so powerful that almost everyone had a reason to want her gone. Chapter 6. Miami belonged to no one anymore. By the early 1980s, Miami had become something unusual. It wasn't controlled by a single cartel, it wasn't controlled by law enforcement, and it wasn't controlled by any one organization. It was fragmented. Overlapping networks operated in the same spaces, alliances shifted without warning, and violence wasn't an exception anymore. It was part of the environment. But inside that instability, one name consistently changed behavior. Not just fear, adjustment. Entire groups altered routes. Negotiations stopped mid-conversation. Disputes that would normally escalate ended abruptly after a single mention passed through the network. A mid-level trafficker arrives in Miami expecting opportunity. He is given contacts, a place to stay, introductions to key figures. But in every room, he notices the same pattern. When Griselda Blanco is mentioned, conversations slow down. Voices lower. Decisions become faster. He doesn't fully understand why, but he understands enough to be careful. What made Griselda's position different wasn't just violence, it was predictability. Most criminal organizations reacted emotionally. Loss triggered retaliation, betrayal triggered escalation. Conflict grew until one side collapsed. Her network didn't behave that way. It responded with structure, not emotion, outcome. And in unstable systems, predictability becomes control. Law enforcement reports from the period describe a city where cocaine routes were no longer fixed. They were adaptive. They shifted constantly based on perceived risk. And in many cases, that risk centered around a single organization. A customs agent reviewing intercepted shipments notices something unusual. Certain routes are suddenly avoided, not after arrests, not after seizures, but after rumors. No official alerts, no confirmed incidents, just information spreading faster than enforcement can track. He later summarizes it simply: we weren't controlling the system anymore. We were reacting to it. By this stage, Griselda's organization had achieved something rare in the cocaine trade. It wasn't only moving product, it was shaping behavior across competing networks. Rival traffickers built strategies around her presence. Some avoided confrontation entirely. Others tried to resolve disputes before they escalated. Even larger organizations adjusted their operations to reduce exposure. In practice, this meant something simple. She didn't need to win every conflict. She only needed to make conflict too expensive to consider. But systems built on fear don't stabilize, they intensify. Every act of control raises expectations. Every demonstration resets the baseline. And over time, the system begins to demand more force to maintain the same balance. That pressure doesn't stay outside, it moves inward. And inside Griselda Blanco's empire, something was beginning to shift. Chapter 8. The Empire That Outgrew Its Architect. By the mid to late 1980s, the pressure surrounding Griselda Blanco had reached another level. Law enforcement agencies were no longer treating her organization as just another trafficking network. They were treating it as a reference point, a structure that appeared repeatedly across unrelated cases, because by then, her influence had already moved beyond any single city. beyond any single route, beyond any single group. But systems built on fear have a limit. They scale quickly and attract attention even faster. And once attention becomes coordinated, the system begins to tighten inward. An investigator sits alone in a quiet office, reviewing years of fragmented case files. Different cities, different arrests, different testimonies. At first, nothing connects. But over time, patterns begin to emerge. A name appears in unrelated investigations, then again and again. Not as proof of direct involvement in every case, but as a recurring reference point across the network. He doesn't describe it as an empire. He describes it as a pattern that keeps repeating itself. In 1985, Griselda Blanco was arrested in California on federal drug charges. It marked the beginning of the end of her direct operational control. But by that point, the organization no longer depended on her daily presence. It functioned through layers of intermediaries, and in systems like that, reputation can replace instruction. Orders don't always need to be spoken, they are inferred, and that creates a paradox. The same structure that creates power also reduces dependency on the person at the center. Even while she faced legal pressure and imprisonment, the network continued adapting. Some relationships fractured, others adjusted, and gradually, the center of gravity shifted. A former associate later described it simply: when she was free, everyone feared her. When she was gone, everyone feared what came next. The system didn't collapse, it redistributed. After her release and continued legal battles, Griselda's direct influence never returned to its peak. The cocaine trade had already evolved, new players had entered, new routes had formed, and the level of violence across the industry had escalated far beyond the scale her early system was built to manage alone. What she once helped shape had become the standard operating environment, and in that environment, individual control becomes difficult to isolate. In the end, Griselda Blanco did not disappear from the world she helped create. She was absorbed into it, still known, still referenced, still feared in memory, but no longer positioned at the center. Because systems built on fear do not preserve loyalty, they preserve behavior, and behavior does not require its architect to remain in place. Griselda Blanco didn't simply move cocaine. She helped define how cocaine trafficking operated for decades after her rise. But the structure she influenced did not remain hers. It belonged to the logic she introduced into it. Fear, once converted into structure, no longer needs permission to continue. And in Miami, that structure never fully disappeared. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Became a Legend. Every empire eventually leaves its creator behind. Not because the creator fails, but because the structure becomes more stable than the person who built it. By the time Griselda Blanco's story reached its final phase, Miami was no longer the same world she entered. The cocaine trade she helped shape had expanded into something larger, faster, more decentralized, more competitive, and less dependent on any single figure. The system had learned to function without permission, without central control, without a single point of direction. But it still carried her imprint. An investigator closes a file after years of reviewing overlapping cases, different names, different cities, different arrests, but the same pattern keeps appearing underneath it all. Not evidence of a single hand controlling everything, but evidence of a logic that spread through the system. He doesn't describe it as a criminal empire. He describes it as something closer to an ecosystem, one that continues to behave according to rules established long before. Years after her most powerful period, Griselda Blanco's name still appears in conversations, reports, and recollections across the drug world, sometimes as history, sometimes as warning, sometimes as legend, but always as reference. And that is what separates individuals from systems. Individuals are remembered for what they did. Systems are remembered for what they made possible. Griselda did not control every outcome that followed her rise. No single person ever does. But she influenced something more persistent than control itself. She influenced behavior, and behavior outlives authority. Because authority depends on presence. Behavior does not. It spreads, it adapts, it continues, long after the original source is gone. Imagine a city long after the person who shaped its most violent years is removed from the picture. The streets are still there, the routes are still used, the patterns still repeat, but the origin is no longer visible. What remains is not memory, it is structure. And structure does not need to be remembered to function, it only needs to be followed. In that sense, Griselda Blanco was never just a trafficker. She became a reference point inside a system that learned from her existence. A warning, a model, a method others studied and reacted to. And over time, that system stopped needing her approval. Because systems do not preserve loyalty to individuals. They preserve what works, and what works gets repeated, whether the origin is remembered or not. In the end, Griselda's real legacy was not the scale of her wealth, or the reach of her network, or even the fear her name carried across Miami. It was the fact that the system she operated in never returned to its previous state. It evolved, it adapted, it absorbed her influence and moved forward without her. That is what happens when power stops being personal. It becomes structural. And structures do not belong to people forever. They belong to the logic that outlives them. Griselda Blanco did not just move cocaine through a network. She helped shape how that network behaved under pressure. And once that behavior was learned, it no longer needed her presence to continue. So the question the story leaves behind is not about how powerful she became, or how feared she was, or how she built what she built. The question is simpler and harder. What happens when a person becomes less important than the system they helped create? The answer is already visible in the world she left behind. The system did not end with her. It continued. Because systems do not remember who started them. They only remember how to function. And in Miami, that function never fully stopped.